I would like to welcome you to this session this afternoon at Marmara International Urban Forum, Managing Risk. How can we establish resilience vis-à-vis natural disasters? And a quick reminder, you may send in your questions via our application. Well, we have distinguished panelists with us. Let me introduce them. Professor Azime Tezer from Istanbul Technical University, Urban Planning, welcome. Distinguished Dursun Yıldız, welcome. Mr. Hitoshi, welcome to you as well, all the way from Japan, the Japanese International Business Agency, senior consultant, and welcome to you as well, Professor from Istanbul Technical University. Distinguished guests, we will be talking about natural disasters in this session. How can we protect ourselves from natural disasters? How can we render our cities more resilient vis-à-vis natural disasters? How can we enhance the resilience of our cities vis-à-vis natural disasters? Our specialists will talk about this and answer your questions in a mere minute. I would like to give the first floor to Mrs. Azime, with your permission, gentlemen. What's the big picture like, especially when we think of Istanbul and our country? What about resilient urban planning vis-à-vis earthquakes? What's the current situation? First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation and providing me the opportunity to speak in front of you. I have a presentation with me. Until the presentation is projected on the screen, I would like to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about. Well, we graduate with the title of urban planners, but we should correct this term and call ourselves space planners, because it's not only cities that we plan plan the country, we plan other spaces. So urban planning is a little outdated and obsolete in my eyes. We should call ourselves space planners. And space planning is really a very important craft and a very important art as well. Because when you plan, you need to take into consideration all the risk factors, including natural disasters, when you set out your space. This is the content of my presentation. I would like to give you an overview of the global situation vis-à-vis cities. The cities are the source of this problem in a way, and cities provide people with a particular quality of life. So cities can be considered both the source and also the solution to this problem. This is why you need to look a specific look at cities. Sustainability, of course, is a buzzword. Sustainability in urban spaces, and what with the expectations of people in all its dimensions, be it social or cultural and so on and so forth, and all the indicators of quality of life take into consideration aspects of sustainability. So this is why I have paid emphasis on this particular subject in my presentation. I hope my presentation will provide answers to your question. This is my presentation. I will talk about resilience and resilience vis-à-vis natural disasters. Urban spaces are out of control and become more and more spaces that pose threats, and rates of urbanization will increase further in the upcoming years. Everything looks like as if we need to pay more attention to urban spaces, and in particular cities, of course. This is the fundamental problem. Sustainability is a buzzword, and this is really an important concept on the global scale. I was just participating, came out of the other session next door. Sustainability was discussed as a buzzword and as an important fundamental dimension to everything that we discuss. But why are we not implementing sustainable solutions and sustainable development goals as they have been set forth by the UN? So this is something we need to take into consideration. There is an important statement that Mr. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said a while ago. We need healthy ecosystems to achieve the sustainable development goals and to address climate change. They can provide 37% of the mitigation that is needed to limit global temperature rise. I consider this very important. We need to adopt a dual perspective when we take into consideration and discuss these subjects. We need to plan our spaces according to the natural given state that is provided. We will be talking about certain subcategories and goals as well when it comes to sustainability. I have limited time, of course, so I will be skipping most of the slides quite quickly. A little piece of criticism from my side. A lot of cities compete when it comes to sustainable development goals. The most livable city, the greenest city, the most sustainable city, and so on and so forth. So a lot of visionary goals and perspectives out there. But apart from that, space management is not really a top priority when it comes to those cities. This is quite interesting in my eyes. This is livable city indicators. I'm not sure whether you can read them, but the management of the soil, of the earth in a way is not really reflected and represented in all of these different indicators worldwide. So spatial planning, or let me call it urban planning for the majority's sake, it is something that needs that puts forth the common good. So we need urban planning or spatial planning for the common good. This is why we want to learn it, because sustainable goals take into consideration the very same principles. It takes into consideration ecology and economy, equity in a way, and this common purpose or common good makes up sustainable development. This is the only way in which we can talk about sustainable development in a way. And from a conceptual perspective, we can talk about complexity concepts or resilience, ecosystem services. I'm not going to go into the details of which, but cities are really very complex entities with all its dimensions. This is why the solutions are also very complex. This is why when you take a look at a disaster, it cannot only be earthquakes, it cannot be one-dimensional. So this is why we need to adopt a more holistic approach. So there are threats coming from nature, decreasing the risk from nature, and at the same time increasing all the benefits that may come about with spaces and spatial planning. Ecosystem services, ecosystem systems, who knows of that? Can you raise your hands? Is those that have heard these concepts, can you raise your hands? Well, as you can see, not many, not place. And also many changes were introduced to the curricula at our faculty as well, because a lot of things are now more important and are of priority. We need to take into consideration what is under threat. It cannot only be focused on earthquakes. And one of the mayors back in the days said the following: hopefully, or inshallah, if God wills, if Allah wills, we will not experience such an earthquake ever again. Well, that is a very futile statement to be made, because we will experience another earthquake, and it is up to us to decide how to face this threat. Please take a look at the gray areas here. The gray areas indicate areas where multiple risk factors come together. The blue areas are areas that are under the threat of floods. And as you can see, natural hazard risks are concentrated within a radius of 10 kilometers from the center of the city. And not only natural risks, of course, but constructional risks come about as well. Buildings that have not been built according to the latest standards, rules and regulations, and so on and so forth. So many criteria flock into the definition of risk factors in Istanbul. So my message would be, we need to combine the two approaches, both benefits and risks. I would like to provide an example from Gazi Osman Pasha municipality. This is a hazard mitigation plan. And Mikdat Hoca has contributed to the mitigation plan. This is an integrated risk assessment, something that we perform, taking into consideration many risk factors, and then we provide mitigation strategies for open spaces, for urban spaces, mitigation strategies for transportation, and also for emergency services, especially in times of earthquakes or natural disasters. Utility services and public services such as hospital services and ambulance and education. The choice of where to build these buildings is very important. And I do know for a fact that municipalities such as Gazi Osman Pasha and many others for which we have provided these mitigation plans have taken our suggestions and recommendations into consideration, and they are currently implementing what we have drawn up for them. And I think it is very important that all local administrations request, and all the public requests, such a mitigation plan in times of natural risks. So it's not only enough and sufficient to take into consideration the risks, but we also need to take into consideration the benefits. I think these plans should become a priority for all urban spaces. And I would like to conclude by uttering a request to the Marmara Belediyeler Birliği Association of Municipalities. They said that instead of providing us a certification of participation, they will plant a tree, which is a wonderful idea. But I would also suggest that they preserve what is already there instead of planting something new. Of course, planting trees is very important, but by planting trees, we do not create forests. We create forests by preserving what already exists. So this is my suggestion to the Association of Municipalities. Planting takes up much longer than preserving what already exists. So this is my wish. Thank you very much.
Çok teşekkür ederiz efendim. Professor Azime Tezer, we would like to thank you very much for this great information. that you provided. Now I would like to leave the floor to Dursun Yıldız. He is in charge of water policies. We talk about earthquake and disaster, but earthquake is not necessarily the single type of disaster that one can think of, and seismologists always remind us of the possible Istanbul and or Marmara earthquake which could happen one day. And you have reports prepared by your association in terms of the water policies. We have striking information, the risk of being without water in the aftermath of a probable Istanbul earthquake, Marmara earthquake. And I know that in 1999 you were in the earthquake zone and you have significant experience. Please go ahead. I need to have the microphone. Well, dear moderator, thank you very much. Dear participants, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Maruf because this is indeed a global agenda and they have brought it to Istanbul, which happens to be a global city. Actually, we have a common denominator, and for that common denominator, in terms of raising awareness, we try to do our best in terms of making a contribution. Dear friends, dear participants, dear professors, well, as distinguished moderator indicated, as the president of Water Policies Association, water and sanitation services and the probable challenges in the aftermath of a disaster, it's what I'm going to focus on today. And in 1999 earthquake, after one day, I was one of the people who actually experienced that smell in the earthquake site. And I was a representative of the Union of Civil Engineers, who were sent to that earthquake site. Well, experiencing is one thing, and waiting to experience it is a completely different thing. The notion of resilience, if it were understood much better by the audience, for example, we should have 8 or 10 times more people in this hall. Well, it's not a criticism, but it's our individual duty and responsibility to have a certain awareness. Well, without further ado, because I have to tell you everything in 15 minutes and I have to be very fast. So it's English. In English, I see some of the headsets are worn by the participants, so we have interpreting. I will talk about all those notions here: ecosystem, circular economy, infrastructure approach, water use, reuse approach, so on and so forth. We have to simply create water carefully. We have to establish smart cities, and these are methods of that. But this time I'm going to talk about something which is not present. And this is what I'm going to share with you. Social infrastructure shortcomings. This is what I'm going to share with you. So this is the approach which we need. Why? Because the past experiences point out to a number of shortcomings in this respect. So the scientific work has not come to a halt, but there is obviously a need for more practical work because something is approaching. And how to live in a resilient city which is resistant against shocks? Very simple question has a very simple answer. You have to take your own responsibility. As the city residents, there are a number of things that we have to do, and demanding is one of those responsibilities. Why do we need to do that? Because we have an approaching threat. In Istanbul, just like we had before, urban flooding has always been a problem, which is a popular one. And we also have one thing which is more urgent, which we try to simply compress into the back of our minds, and we have somehow learned and mastered the art of living with it, which is the earthquake. And many things have been achieved until now, and we all know that. But are we really ready for that? Well, many things have been achieved in the last 2 decades, so many projects. And indeed, we had great outcomes, we made great progress, and I'm not saying these things to belittle them. He has to speak to the microphone closer. And there's still a reality, and the name of that reality is, and after one day, the day after is in Istanbul, 2.4 million people, residents of Istanbul, will be homeless, without water, without sanitation. And they're going to be simply left without these premises. And before simply feeling that need, and Mikdat Bey will talk about that, and raising an awareness and the mitigation of crisis. What shall we do? So, in Istanbul, in the aftermath of a disaster, in terms of the water and sanitation, these are the potential risky areas. You see, so this map is indicating the positions of the sanitation and water supply areas. So it's not their actual locations, but where the depots, the storage places are, and the treatment facilities. 2/3 of them are directly in the epicenter of the possible earthquake. So, and is that a huge damage? Yes, because they're not powerful structures. He's not speaking to the microphone. I'm so sorry. Well, 2/3 of that will be damaged. And where is going to be the biggest damage in the drinking water supply? The place indicated in that rectangle. Which are places which are marked in pink and red, and the blue parts indicate drinking water supply. They will be completely damaged. And depending on the which neighborhoods are they? He's not audible. The moderator needs to turn off her microphone. I'm sorry, it's inaudible. I can't hear him. The moderator needs to turn off her microphone. Thank you so much. So, these are actually very well-known areas. When there is this fractured fault line in Marmara, these are the places which have previously shown themselves. In 1999, whatever the damage was, it's going to be an exponential increase in the damage. We all know that's going to be the case. So this part indicated in this rectangular area. Avcılar, Küçükçekmece, Bakırköy, shall I go on? So these are very well-known facts. I don't want to create a tension and depress people. We have to focus on the solution, not by creating anxiety among people. Well, Professor Mikdat is going to say horrible things now, and probably he's going to tell us about the solutions as well. I will talk about the risks. Water and sewage systems are not sound, they're vulnerable. The connections are not very reinforced either. We need major investments to simply reinforce them. However, in the day after, we also need one thing, which is water. And that would be required to put out the fires. In a symposium last year, I think around 3,000 fires will be created. There is a risk after the earthquake. They are called fires following earthquakes. And for those fires, of course, there is certain due preparation, and there are sometimes briefings about those. But what's happening on the global scale? Let me give you a number of examples. In San Francisco, they already have developed a system using seawater to put off the fires. Mr. Baba perhaps will mention that subject. I'm not sure whether that's available in Japan, but they have a system to intervene and put off the fires using seawater, and they have finalized it in Los Angeles. Almost the same thing is what they try to implement, and the work in Los Angeles in these areas, the models try to foresee if there's a fire. So in such areas, they say that, and they're prepared for that. So which means that the world is actually getting ready by doing something like this. They are going to collect water through pump stations, and as you see, these are the storage places, $100,000 of cost that we're talking about. But in case of an earthquake, particularly in privileged, prioritized risky areas, they will designate it and they will intervene. They have done that and implemented that. $100,000, they simply work on that and update it every 5 years. Well, in Turkey, this is actually a very clear recommendation, and this is what I know. In Istanbul, they are now working on Istanbul Water Management Master Plan. They plan to complete it in 2 years, and in that master plan, there is a chapter called Water Management in the Earthquake, and they are going to probably offer so many alternatives. And following this, the experience, which was 5.8 which magnitude, they have to simply take that into consideration. As an NGO working in water, I simply tried my best to share those with you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in the world, in order to offer resilience, which is a must in the cities against disasters, there is another thing which is very significant, and that is we had the explanation by Istanbul mayor, and he said that probably socially as a nation we're not ready for earthquake. Is there a criterion for that? Yes, there is. Yes, the last earthquake. And do we have a coefficient for that? Is there any work in the world on the global scale? So what is your disaster preparedness level? Yes, there is. Yeah, we have İTÜ, Istanbul Technical University. They are doing this in the form of PhD thesis. Well, we have a PhD thesis. That was a great PhD thesis. And actually, he or she was very successful in Turkey. I would like to congratulate that candidate because that's very important. And that resilience coefficient is going to be determined on global regional organizations, community levels, which we know is not very easy, but we know there are some methodologies to do that. And community disaster resilience is one of those fields. And that's very hard to do. So in the aftermath of an earthquake or disaster, with the people who end up on the streets, what are we going to do with those without getting terrified or, simply losing ourselves into panic or, without losing ourselves? What to do, where to go? We have to have an awareness and we have to have a training. How are we going to do that? It's not only going to be through the tools and instruments of state. NGOs are going to play a significant role, and we saw in that PhD thesis that was the same bottom line. We're going to share the responsibility. As you could see here, community-based resilience is significant, and I think among the other set of notions, that's what we saw as a problem, which we saw in the previous earthquake, telecommunication, and that is marked with a question mark, because that's one of the most important parts of that chain. Unfortunately, that was broken in the last earthquake. So, to form a community resilience, against possible disasters, we have to start from the individual and work our way towards the organizations, and we have to reinforce everything in between. That's a process, and that process has to be followed up very closely. That's a rather new notion. The notion of social resilience or community resilience is a rather new notion, and through individual efforts and network of relations. So you see, to the last step, which indicates there are strong relationships between organizations, that covers a process. And if you pay attention, always talks about organizational connection. Which organizations are we talking about? Is it the public or the local administration institutions? We know that, they've already proven that they have good collaboration. But what is missing is the part of the NGOs, like the grassroots, everything in the bottom line. The organizations which will improve everything, develop everything. We know NGO and civil society has to be cared about more. Social infrastructure, which we are always focusing on more and more. The structural infrastructure, actually, coupled with the reinforcement of the social infrastructure, is what really matters. What shall we do for that? Yes, is world doing something for that? Yes. In Vancouver, they are preparing social infrastructure plans, which they did actually in 2017. Well, we had some messages, some lessons from the earthquakes. And among those, if you have good infrastructure and good set of relationships, in some of the cases, you will mitigate your losses and you will be able to survive the disaster. Please pay attention to these pictures one by one. People are trying to one thing, and really they are simply putting their blood and sweat into those. I was there personally, and we are going to try to save one thing, just like you see in these pictures. People are involved in an effort to save one thing. But now when I show you the last one, which is this one, so all of those in the same picture or photograph without any coordination. See, they are all isolated efforts which have nothing to do with them, but they are all based on good intentions. Let me put that way. The roles of NGOs have been acknowledged by the world in the Sendai framework. The NGOs were given a great responsibility, which is internationally acknowledged, and we have to do our work. And I have found two theses online. I did Google search. This is a PhD thesis. The first one is a master thesis. The master one is directly about Istanbul, and it says that Turkey is determined to shift their behavior to a resilience culture. So it's making progress. I don't know what Professor Mikdat has to say about that, but that's one of the findings of the thesis. There is progress, but very slow progress. So I think a small contribution to Professor what will say, I think that has to be accelerated. What about the PhD thesis findings? They did field work, and they saw that there was a survey, and the respondents responded to that. And the survey took place with 700 respondents. 60% said that the municipality is not successful. 60% again respond to the questions saying that, well, those work on volunteers is actually rather useful. 80% say that Istanbul is not well prepared for natural disasters. And 65% of the respondents say that, you know what, we individually have not prepared so much for the earthquake. And we have not sufficient information. 7% said that they are members of an NGO which have to do with the disaster or earthquake. But we actually have to take something from this, we have a lesson to take. 64% say that, well, if anyone comes to us or an organization, we are more than willing to become members or make any contribution. So in terms of simply guiding the way, this work and these theses are very important. And we have another field of challenge. Despite all the efforts, we all know that, feel that, we hear that. So these are actually my last slides. I'm going to complete in 1 minute. Some recommendations for Istanbul. Well, first of all, for Istanbul, and then for Turkey. For Istanbul, I do agree with the professor. In Istanbul, in Turkey, we need to have a mobility in Turkey for disaster, and Istanbul has to be prioritized. You have our support, and we openly declared that because we know we could foresee what's going to happen and how that's going to happen. And a mobility. So, a mobility in the framework of what I've told you, from the bottom to the top, in the day after. Have you seen that movie? Probably you have seen that. Following that night, once you put your foot into the street with the person you encounter, what are you going to do? Where are you going to head towards? And in that turmoil, with whom you are going to get into contact, which councils, and what kind of prep that you have to make. There has to be an announcement of a mobility. Professor Dr. Mikdat Kadıoğlu. Well, he's going to explain it more when he has the floor. But we say that that is the right thing to do because first of all, we have to know and identify what is the current level of Istanbul. About what? Well, we already tested ourselves. Where we have not tested ourselves, in the community preparedness. What is the level of that? Is there a criterion for that? Yes, there's a criterion. Is it too difficult? Yes, it's too difficult. Can we do that? Yes. What would be the function of that? We would have more and smarter precautions. So we will see where we are short and simply bridge the gaps. What shall we do more? Social infrastructure plan should be drafted. Is there anything as such? Not that I know of. Is there? It's completed. Okay, so congratulations. Social infrastructure plan, which is a rather new notion. So I think that's going to make great contributions to this recent time. So please just finish it. Well, culture of resilience. Well, in terms of the cultural resilience to make progress, are there any things that we have to do? Of course, you know, well, we call this state of emergency. This is what we claim. We need to declare state of emergency. Istanbul is worth it. And of course the residents of Istanbul deserve that. And we are all aware of that fact. Istanbul deserves that. But we just don't need to have to wait. So, in conclusion, if a city would like to achieve higher resilience, these are what we have to do. What is the existing level? We have to have comprehensive and holistic views. NGO network has to be established, not only here, not only in the cities, in the region, and all throughout the region among NGOs. In Ankara, if there's an NGO who would like to work in Istanbul earthquake, should be notified from now on. So all throughout the country, well, in order to simply intervene, make the intervention, there are going to be some NGOs. And as Professor indicated, there has to be mandatory training. And again, coordination agencies have to be established as a concluding remark. Well coordinated and well-defined plans for NGOs. Well-defined. This is where I would like to emphasize, because mainly we lack that part. NGOs are merely simply put onto the circle, which says NGOs, onto the paper. There are reasons for that. We have to eliminate those. Very well-defined plans. Social infrastructure plan. A city has to be put into place. That would help us in terms of resilience. Thank you so much.
Teşekkür ediyoruz efendim. Sayın Dursun.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dursun. He gave some important warnings in a probable Istanbul earthquake. He mentioned that millions of people would go without water and food and buildings would be damaged. Of course, when we say earthquake, the country that has the most experience in that regard is Japan, and we have an important guest with us. Mr. Hitoshi Baba is with us. He's a senior consultant for the Japanese earthquake agency, and he has worked together with the greater municipality of Istanbul before. So let's ask for a picture of Turkey in that regard, and especially coming to last week's earthquake 5.8, GSM operators were non-functional. What is happening in Japan if an earthquake strikes?
For your introduction, and I'm working for JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, as an advisor in the field of disaster risk management. And particularly, my field of science is flood disaster. However, today, let me introduce a new concept of disaster risk management in a wide area of disaster target, like Istanbul or any other cities where many industries are agglomerating and populations are concentrating. That is named as Area BCM, Area Business Continuity Management, developed by JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. Before talking about the Area BCM, I'd like to reaffirm the global target, as you know, internationally agreed at the time of UN ISDL conference in Sendai, 2015, consisting of, reducing mortality, reducing affected people, number of affected people, reducing the damage to critical infrastructure and basic services, and finally, reducing economic loss. As you can see on the chart, the target of reducing economic loss is the most holistic one, because the measures for this target can benefit for other all target issues like infrastructure damage, affected people, and mortality. And thinking about the measures of reducing economic loss, one important or effective tool is the business continuity management. However, as you can see, economic loss is significantly increasing in recent years. And the disaster scale, magnitude, is intensifying because of the climate change, because of the urbanization, asset concentration. Then economic loss is sharply increasing. The impact of the economy is globalizing through supply chain. For example, at the time of Great East earthquake in Japan, a very small private company's production has disrupted. And then, at the end of the day, General Motors in the US stopped their operation. So globalizing impact. So local economy is not for local development. Local economy is very important for global. And private sector's role is very much highlighted. You know, the BCP, is already internationally standardized. However, we experienced at the time of Great East Japan earthquake in 2011, as well as the big flood disaster in Thailand, Chao Phraya River flood, where many big companies forced to stop their operation, even if they have established the BCP and operated as planned. Many companies have to stop their operation. Why? Because many external resources such as electricity, water, energy, communication, transportation were disrupted. So they cannot produce production and transport, export. They need to stop the operation. So we need new concept of the business continuity in area-wide scale, not only for the single company. Then we developed Area BCM, which requires, first of all, public-private coordination and probabilistic analysis of risks and impacts. Then we need to manage the critical external resources, as I mentioned. How to allocate the critical external resources to a specific company or specific facility. It needs pre-arrangement of the restoration. And finally, we need area-wide scalability of the management. This is a definition of the area BCM. Simply speaking, area BCM is defined as the scalable cross-sector coordination framework of risk management for business continuity in certain area, participated by the government agency, infrastructure providers, and lifeline operators, and the local community as well. We need to involve the local community, as Professor mentioned. And finally, the private sectors, private enterprises are also a very important partner to join this framework. Making the risk assessment, first of all, and business impact analysis, BIA. And then they should share the area BCM strategy. Then, in a coordination, they should develop the plan, action plan. Then they should implement the planned measures and evaluate, reviewing, and evaluate, monitoring, and improve the system itself. And this is a cycle. Continuously, it should be maintained. The benefits of area BCM, in terms of public support, the area BCM can encourage the public sector to invest more resilient, robust infrastructure. It can also unify the efforts of the area, direct towards a common goal, achieve restoration quickly, effectively, and efficiently. The framework also increased the responsibility under the area BCM, establishing their own BCP. Actually, we have already applied this concept in some countries, some industrial areas, and in some areas, private companies have started establishing their own BCP. It also cooperates with other partners and clients of each enterprises through the enhanced communication. And also it enhances supply chain coordination. And also it increases asset values for investment, attract other enterprises to be in the area, city. Finally, it can foster the local economy and employment. Okay, today I'd like to explain some examples in 5 minutes. We have already applied in Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam. I forgot one thing. Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, okay, yeah. So today I'd like to introduce the case study of Indonesia, Bekasi Karawang Industrial Area, making many analysis and business impact analysis. And finally, it's difficult. Yeah, finally, the buildings in industrial park, accordingly to the assessment, is safe at the time of the scenario. The scenario is flooding over the area. The facilities are not damaged. However, electric power and lifelines are disrupted for about 2 weeks. Transportation infrastructure is also inundated and stopped operation for about 2 weeks. And the workers of industrial parks are unable to come to their factory because their homes are inundated. So the factory itself is safe, but they need to stop operation. Finally, they formulated the BCP, includes strengthening transportation networks, alternative port development, power substations protection, backup of business resources, support of stranded workers, such as temporary accommodation shelters, and so on. Another example in the Thailand, actually the area was severely inundated at the time of 2011 big flood. And they have also formulated the framework and discussed many times and finalized. I have not enough time to explain all the measures, but they formulated many action plans, such as, water supply system protection or something like that. Standardization of this method, new concept. As you know, we have already some internationally agreed standard, including individual BCP at the center, BCMS, ISO 22301. Probably many major companies have already been applying this ISO. And we are now going to add one international standard in between the emergency information sharing and communication family and preparedness of organizational interoperability. Actually, Technical Committee 292 is the room where researchers and many scientists are discussing about the new international standard, including Japanese professors. And particularly the working group 2, 3, 5 are the places where are very, very much involved in this discussion of the new standard of area-wide business continuity management. And finally, yes, societal resilience in community, infrastructure, and economy as one package requires widely coordinated risk reduction systems such as area PCM, which could be applicable in Istanbul or any other cities, I believe. And JICA is always keen on supporting this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Teşekkür ediyoruz. Sayın Hitoshi Baba'ya da
Thank you very much, Mr. Hitoshi Biba, for these valuable pieces of information. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Mikdat Kadıoğlu. We've talked about earthquakes, but when we say natural disasters, floods are also important, especially what with recent years, floods are on the agenda not only in Istanbul, but throughout the country, with mortality rates very, very high. You have the floor, sir.
The moderator's mic is on, whereas Mikdat Bey's mic is off. I'm so sorry. Could you please kindly warn them? He has to speak to the microphone and the moderator has to turn off. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, it's inaudible otherwise. He's not audible. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Well, it's not going to be very theoretical, and I'm sure once you leave here, you will know what I mean. Well, in order to create resilience, thank you so much, by the way, that's very kind of you. In order to create resilience, there are 3 elements. What were they called in Turkish? SDGs, Sustainable Development, disaster risk mitigation, and adaptation to climate change. Can you deliver these 3 all? That's where the problem arises. The problem of Turkey is this as well. We can't integrate these 3 things in governance. Our leaders, be it international, local, or central governors, well, if they simply feature all these 3 simultaneously by simply cutting down the waste of money and labor properly, we can manage resilience against disasters in our cities. So be it the government, municipalities, they have different departments which are not, knowledgeable about the other ones. There is no coordination. So if we can offer these 3, that's great. If we can't, that means we are wasting our time and money. And I would like to share some examples. Climate change, population increase, disasters, climate is disappearing, environment is disappearing. These are the 4 major problems of the world right at the moment. And I will be focusing on climate change as well as disasters. So, with the human growth and ecosystems degradation, I'm not going to develop on this. Do you know this sir, this guy, Ulrich Beck? Well, if you are working in disaster, this is a must read, Risk Society. This was translated into Turkish. And one day he took there was a conference in Harvard, and he took the floor before I did. He's now dead, and he was one of the biggest philosophers of our time. He said risk is social and it can't be formulated. Whereas my speech was all about formulas. So before me, he was saying that I'm an engineer, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm an engineer. For me, risk is equal to hazard times by vulnerability. In order to mitigate the risk, what shall I do? to either mitigate hazard or vulnerability or both. So I'm an engineer. That's my take on the subject. Okay. So what are those risks? What are hazards? What are vulnerabilities? So I don't think we need to develop on those. There are different methods to write down the formula. There are so many formulas of the equations of the earthquake. So if I would like to mitigate risk, I have to simply mitigate hazards so that, I shall be able to reduce those down. For example, can I change the fault line, the position of the fault line of the earthquake? After 1999, there was a discussion, if you remember. Let's simply move the fault lines to the south. And Bursa said, no, just don't simply change it. I swear to you, I swear in the name of God, there was this discussion, changing the positions. Japanese people can't do that. We can do that, see? At least on the plan, we can change the places. There are many people in the districts. But you know what? There are officials who are tampering with the places of the fault lines. Well, our Japanese guests won't understand that, of course, but we Turkish people are strange in that respect. Okay, so... Well, the Islamic countries or OIC countries, when you look at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, vulnerability, exposure to disasters is sort of at the average medium of the global world, less than the developed countries. And actually there is this hazard, and I saw a sign the other day. This is the street of the name is followed after the creek. In Japan, do we have any creek street? Probably there is no, but we have everything in Turkey. So, well, the creek, do they have a street? Ihlamur Dere. Well, whenever there is a flood, just see that there is the name of the creek, Dere, in the names of the streets. Poor people are more prone to that, whereas the rich ones simply lose their wealth. So we should be actually happy that we are poor. So, there is this reality. I'm just kidding, but there is this reality. You probably know that. And these are the statistics. In the economic losses, the wealthy people are losing quite a lot. However, death or lives, poor people tend to die more. Maybe this has to do with the overpopulation. What did I tell you before? Sustainable development and risk mitigation coupled with adaptation to climate change. This is all about the disaster management. It's not a search and rescue problem in Turkey. It's a development problem. Disaster management is a development problem. You could say, whenever something happens in developed country, they absorb it and they recover so fast and continue developing. Whereas in the developing countries, disasters hit the development, and you see the gap with the developed countries is becoming more and more. And we are always spending our money on mitigation and recovery and resilience, mitigation, disaster preparedness. Actually, we have to see it as a development problem. It's not a search and rescue problem. Not training the cats and dogs and the guys in red. No, forget about this. But this is all about that in Turkey. So resilience in disaster. Whenever a disaster happens, how to absorb, to what extent you could absorb the shock, and you can recover and simply go back to the development. That period is very important, and unfortunately we are sort of like that green line in between. Of course there are people who perform worse than us, but this should be our main target. And last week, that was actually sort of a benchmark to see how much progress we made. Well, of course, may Allah or God protect us, but actually the bigger part of the fault line, which is to be broken, is there. It's intact. So, climate change, you understand that there's a correlation. If you see the smoke, there is a relationship between the flooding. So I think we were able to simply improve the understanding. So, dear friends, for us, the relationship of climate change is very obvious with the disasters. And the more climate change we're going to have, the more meteorological disasters the hail we're going to have on your cars. Cars are more valuable, right, than your life. If people buy cars, they're all of a sudden meteorologists. Professor, they ask me, is there going to be hail or any disaster? And this is the comparison with the 60s and 90s. And they tripled. The number of meteorological events was tripled. And 9 times higher economic losses, 15 times higher insured losses. And now the big insurance companies started to recruit meteorological engineers. Sonoma Japan, Vivasan. And, gradually everyone is going to meet a meteorological engineer in their lifetime. And am I going too fast? I'm so terrified of the moderator. Okay, so economic losses increase. The greens indicate geological disasters like earthquake, and hydrometeorologicals are the ones which are indicated in blue. And as you could see in both categories, we have a huge increase. However, in the hydrometeorological, there is a very immediate surge. So adaptation to the climate change. If we are going to have any adaptation to climate change, it has to be a part of that overall understanding. In 2050, $300 billion economical loss by 2050. So it is $608 billion in a decade. And every year it's going to be $300 billion of economic loss. And due to the meteorological early warning, there has been a reduction in the deaths due to the hydrometeorological events. But in earthquake, there is no such reduction. But because of the early warning system, the deaths, it's not economic losses. We can't move the house, but we can simply make sure that we don't die. Early warning, early detection is very important, as we heard from the distinguished professor. Well, how to reduce disaster risk? Geophysical hazards and society, the vulnerability of the society, the possible exposure. And we have a disaster at the intersection. In order to reduce or mitigate the risk, can I simply cut down the geophysical hazards? Or what shall I do for the society? We should raise awareness. And why are we talking about, if that's the case, why are we talking about fault lines? If we understand that we can't do anything with the fault lines. Do we have the fault over here? Your fault line is much better than my fault line. Why are we talking about fault lines? Provided that, you can still change its place on paper, of course. But, so vulnerability is at the highest in the OIC countries. I don't know why. Even twice higher than the developing countries. So that's the case. And we should mitigate, reduce our vulnerability, and we should make it, change it, disaster. Please do not dwell upon the disaster. The other day, the E2 group, in order to take a much better photo of the fault line, they asked 1.5 million euro from the mayor. I think that money should be spent on much more sound houses. We know the danger. The time is to reduce and mitigate the risk. We should not talk about and spend all of our time talking about the fault lines. And this is the Sendai framework, and you have to mitigate disaster risk for resilience. So, and that's an important tag. So, the earthquake risk in Istanbul is unacceptable. It's intolerable. And according to the most optimistic scenario, in Istanbul, 34,000 buildings are going to be severely damaged. 34,000 buildings are going to be severely damaged. And if that's the case, I'm sorry, but you can't manage that earthquake. You can't find search and rescue teams in that number. Even in the Milky Way, you can't find it, let alone in the world. So, what does disaster mitigation means? We have to decrease that number to 34. And the biggest problem is that we are very slow in terms of mitigation of the risk, and unfortunately we can't seem to make fast progress. Well, this could be for both earthquakes, structural and non-structural hazards mitigation. So, you have to have the sound or resilient buildings, and you have to fix your objects. And if you ask me a question, are we ready for the earthquake, or how shall we prepare? We can make a small experience, if you want, an experiment. So that's where we lose everything, actually, in Istanbul, in terms of the context of earthquake. And the world, the huge spendings, all of the spendings, that aid, $3.3 trillion by 2010. And 65% of that money was spent on intervention in the world. That's what we do. We follow suit. We have to spend that money on risk mitigation. But, well, I'm not sure how that's going to happen. It's like actually the Black Sea people of Turkey, who are notoriously known for their reverse thinking. So we should spend this money on risk mitigation. However, we are simply doing the opposite of that, and that's a wrong approach. And as we heard from the previous speakers, prior to the disasters, if you spend 1 lira, you make a profit of at least 4 lira. Or if that's not the case, it could be actually 1 to 100. If you don't spend that 1 lira before the disaster happens, then after it happens, you have to spend 100 units of the same money. So now coming to the climate change, we have meteorological hazards and disasters like flooding, forest fires, so on and so forth. For me to be able to mitigate that risk in the meteorological hazards, I have two chances. I could either reduce that down, or I could reduce the vulnerability. How are we going to do that? By adaptation to the climate change. Well, if you simply achieve that, that would work. Just have a look at the OIC countries. Adaptation to climate change does not exist. See, can you see the numbers? Why is that the case? Well, I think the sociologists and psychologists have to look into the causes. What is the problem? Muhammad, the Prophet, says that you should simply trust your Creator, Allah, but you should still fix your camel, and so that it won't run away. So these are the things that we can't overcome. So there are so many things. And insurance is one of those. And that is actually a global example, the mandatory earthquake insurance. That is very important. And they are also reinsured. And this is what we try to do. TARSIM is what we try to develop as insurance. After the earthquake, at least 10,000 lira insured their houses. 250 lira. Oh my God! Don't be just like the people from the Black Sea. 250 lira. Just insure it. Most of your houses do not have smoke detectors. I'm selling those. So coming to the conclusion. So resilience and adaptation is not about the regulations or money. It's about the mentality. And we have to definitely change that mentality. We have to start from the weakest link. You are only as strong as your weakest link. And I have been mentioning and telling this from the morning, from the very beginning. Disaster risk management, adaptation to climate risk. And in 2012, the world actually united this. And what do they name it? They called it climate risk management. Were we able to unite this? Most of you do not have any idea about that. Climate risk management, there is such a notion which is serving the same purpose. So they are working for the climate change adaptation, for disaster, for the flooding, for the fires. And they are not coordinated with one another. And we have a fortune to spend, right? We don't have time. So this is the holistic approach that we need to install. We shall be able to do that. In 2012, United Nations published this, issued this. And they also asked for a report for Turkish climate risk management. You could find it online. If we could unite those initiatives, we might be sounder. So, holistically, we need to look at these issues. I'm going to mitigate the risk. These are the hazards. This is the exposure. These are the vulnerabilities. So, what happens in Turkey? You know, you go and find the guy in the municipality, and they do their project, and the other guy does this. They are fragmented. They don't speak to one another. And as parts of a master plan, we have to have a holistic approach. You got my point? We have to have a unison. We can't actually do this on their own. Otherwise, they're merely left on the shelves. I think that requires no further explanation. Okay, moderator, I'm done. So, thank you. Let's manage the risks, not the damages. Well, you get my point. If you have any questions, I will explain you what to do in the earthquake. Thank you so much.
Teşekkür ediyoruz Profesör Doktor Mikdat Kadıoğlu'na da verdiği değerli bilgiler için.
Thank you very much for these valuable pieces of information. There are no questions via the app that were sent in, but if you'd like to ask live questions, we can pass on the microphone. Distinguished guests, do you have questions? Well, somebody here in the front. If you could pass on the mic to the lady in front. The gentleman, I'm sorry. Yes, please. Thank you very much. We do not have any sound. Now we can hear him. Now we can hear him. But it comes and goes. The sound comes and goes. I don't get the proper sentence. I'm sorry, we cannot hear the gentleman from time to time. There are disruptions in the sound. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So I take a look at the televisions. Politics are being discussed after a disaster, after an earthquake. It was the case last week as well, and they're discussing past plans. That meeting points were requested, 700 of them, and now we only have 70 of these meeting points because all the other meeting point spaces were given away for developmental purposes to shopping mall constructors and so on and so forth. And this is not correct, because this issue concerns all of us, and we need to adopt this in a very smart fashion. Because if we don't do that, then there is a lot more that is awaiting us. I wish we only had the opportunity to go on TV and hold such a panel on TV. How many people have insured themselves? Or maybe they would have organized themselves. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say. Well, anyone that would like to respond? The gentleman pointed out the issue of meeting points in case of emergencies. This was discussed for the past 1 week. How many meeting points do we need in such a big city? Well, you're going to be surprised. But you can also ask my Japanese colleague here. Parks and gardens are not meeting points. They are not. You cannot meet in a park, in a similar garden or whatnot, because there are no facilities, no toilets, nothing. Primary meeting points have to be solid buildings, such a gym, for example, a very solid building. Please request meeting points that are closed spaces, such a building, buildings, because you won't be able to spend time in a garden, for example, in a green space in the middle of winter if a disaster strikes. Well, the solutions that are provided, they are very superficial. In Japan, the first meeting points, the primary meeting points are gyms, are school buildings, solid buildings. If they are filled up, yes, then you can opt for the gardens and green spaces because you don't have any other space, okay. But yes, of course, we would like to have gardens and parks and whatnot, but they are not the first meeting point of choice. So please request accordingly. Then the social dimension. Disaster management rules and regulations are not comprehensive enough. Citizens are considered victims of disasters only in the regulations and not active participants as decision makers. So this is our management understanding. The drills are coined security drills. In no drill is there place to use a helicopter, for example. It's only show based. It's a mere show that they put on. In Japan, for example, they have regular drills. For example, on the anniversary of an earthquake or another disaster, all schools, all hospitals, everyone participates in these drills. My grandchildren, they just moved to Japan, and they just underwent their first drill, and they were quite afraid because it was the first time that they did such a drill in Japan. But now they know because they hadn't done something like that in Japan. And the funny thing is that everyone came in the clothes they were currently wearing, so in their suits, in their mini skirts, because it's not only in sweatpants and in your pajamas that the disaster strikes, right? You have to be prepared at all times. You have to know how to perform first aid. You have to know how to extinguish a fire. You have to know how to do CPR, for example. So, and this is why in Turkey this is not done, and this is why we keep on talking and not doing in Turkey. Well, I fully second what Mikdat Hoca says. All the rules and regulations have to be fully functional and implementable and also accessible to all the citizens. It's also, I believe, a very critical issue to take a look at the spaces that are now being used for other purposes that were once outlined as meeting points. For example, an open space or a building that is now being used as a shopping mall, for example. Are we going to meet in a shopping mall? No. Are we going to go shopping when an earthquake strikes? No. So I believe that the ratio between open spaces and developed spaces needs to be balanced. It has a very important effect on ecology as well. I would also like to make an addition. Distinguished friends, dear friends, the common denominator in all the presentations, mine included, is social resilience. You spoke about societal resilience and in Turkey, society is only a victim. Society is a victim of disaster. They are not a shareholder. They are not a decision maker, and we lack the necessary and sufficient rules and regulations. Yes. Hello. What do you have to say about wastewater management in Istanbul being thrown literally into the Marmara Sea? And the Marmara Sea is on the earthquake fault line. And what do you have to say about that? Wastewater management and wastewater disposal into the Marmara Sea, no more fish. And the earthquake risk on top of that. And I believe that the pollution of the Marmara Sea stands in direct correlation to the earthquake risk in Istanbul. Are you aware of this paper? Well, wastewater management is not my area of expertise, but let me just mention that we are drowning in our own shit, so to speak, in Istanbul. Back in the days, in Istanbul, people were carrying humongous fish because the Marmara Sea was so abundant and so full of fish. And the Marmara Sea was famous for its big fish, but now in Istanbul we do not have any more fish. We did a TV program just a couple of weeks ago with a Japanese partner about the lack of fish or scarcity of fish in our waters. But we have experts here. But it's good that we dump our waste on the fault line, isn't it? Well, it's of course a very important issue that wastewater is being treated and then disposed of into other waters. And this is something that Istanbul is partially successful in doing. Unfortunately, the Marmara Sea is an inland sea. And the Marmara Sea stands under the influence of many, many other factors. The Marmara Sea is of such a composition that you need to treat the wastewater even more than you would usually do. But usually it's disposed of at a distance. May I add something? I've listened to a speech by Edis Hun. This study that was done mentions that the wastewater is disposed of in the Black Sea, so far away from Istanbul, but because of the currents, it comes back to Istanbul through the Bosphorus Strait. Is it really necessary to dispose all of that water into the sea? Why are we not able to use it for other purposes, or how are there any other ways to dispose of it? Well, why is that? Well, the reason is economy. It's trying to save money. I would, of course, prefer the wastewater to be disposed of in the Black Sea. If I have to choose, the Marmara Sea is not my first choice. First the gentleman, then the lady in the back. MSG Group, my question goes to Mikdat Hoca. We always say Allah korusun, which means may Allah protect us. But if an earthquake happens, then disaster will have stricken us. Can we establish maybe local institutions that take care of all the victims? Can you ask Mr. Mikdat to turn off his microphone to the right of you? Thank you very much. Thank you. 11,000 people after the huge earthquake, the major earthquake back in 1999, they underwent trainings, different kinds of first aid and CPR trainings. Have you ever taken a first aid training at all? No, you didn't? Well, we always complain and then we always request, although we haven't undergone a first aid training ourselves. If during an earthquake has a bleeding is bleeding during an earthquake, a loved one, somebody we know, we don't know how to perform first aid. So even with a minor bleeding, our loved ones will die. We are Turkish, and as Turks, we do not prefer to admit that we don't know something. I don't know how the Japanese would behave in such a situation, but we never think about the consequences. We never think about what would eventually happen if disaster strikes. Insurance and proper training, what to do, knowing what to do during an earthquake, what happens if a fire ignites, how are you going to extinguish that? First aid is actually very easy, and if everyone knows what to do, then it'll be fine. The first 3 days are very, very important. It's really of no use if somebody at the top, some regulators, do something. It comes down to us. We need to be in a position to implement first aid, to do first aid, right? We do have a disaster implementation plan, remember? I was acting as a consultant back in the day when this plan was incepted, and everybody's responsibilities and liabilities were set out. But this system, this plan, has not been internalized yet. We're still thinking about crisis management centers and so on and so forth, crisis committees. But everybody talks about these crisis management centers, but they do not exist. They are non-functional. So it has to start with the individual. You have to think about yourself first, and then about your children, your family. Why do you not fix your cupboard? Why do you not fix your cupboard? I don't know. My wife doesn't allow it because she's afraid that her clothes might get damaged or whatnot. Well, the problem is that everybody tries to save Turkey, but nobody is willing to save themselves. Business continuity. Business continuity. Japan is thinking about business continuity because they have solved the problem on the individual level, right? How are your factories? How are your business units, your utility providers, and so on and so forth going to stand upright in a case of an earthquake? That's important. What are you going to do without water, without facilities, without communication? Save yourself first and then save the country. Was that too egocentric? Well, the lady first and then the gentleman. Hello, my name is Rüya Kaya. Thank you very much for all of your contributions.
Tokyo Metropolitan Government has just released a guideline for sort of a communication strategy for individuals when an earthquake or any disaster happens. So, and we've been discussing about the community resilience and individual resilience and the preparation that we need to take care. And do you aware of this disaster prepared Tokyo guideline or any other manual, or do you think that that is effective and it can be customized to Turkish context? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. If we talk about community capacity in terms of disaster management, an important thing is to develop the capacity through the latest development of information and communication technology, because according to our experience in Hanshin Awaji earthquake in 1995. At that time, we have no internet, and almost all communication lines have disrupted. And then, in times of a great East earthquake, and again we disrupted the communication, but we used the internet, such as Facebook and Twitters and so on. Then, at the time of Kumamoto earthquake in 2016, we had no disruption of communication lines because of the community capacity developed by themselves. They avoided to use their phone calls. They used the very light communication traffic way, such as Facebook and so on. No disruption. So people could understand the way of the best communication. That is one example. And also the local government, as well as central government, applying the education programs for the people. However, education program of the community empowerment. However, today's challenge is to how to convince the people to evacuate quickly. We are still experiencing many difficulties in time of disaster about the rate of evacuation, which is very low. Only a few % of the people evacuate at the time of, for example, the last year's big flood disasters in the eastern part of Japan. Only a few % of the people evacuated themselves, instead of the early warnings and evacuation order. So now we are struggling with how to convince the people to evacuate themselves. Is that the right answer to you?
Teşekkür ediyoruz. Sağ olunuz.
Thank you very much.
Var oraya da verelim mikrofonu.
Merhaba, ismim Celal Güloğlu, Türk Kızı.
Celal Güloğlu. I work in Turkish Red Crescent. My question is for you, Dursun Bey. About water treatment, I received a training from the German Red Cross, particularly about the domestic water treatment. We took water, we pumped water from a lake, and using some filtration techniques, we treated and we drank that water. But this was rather professional. On water sanitation and wash level, as an NGO, maybe school training or NGO community training, what do you do? So as Turkish Red Crescent, we started to work. Mikdat Bey knows it much better than I do. And in collaboration with the other NGOs, do you have any collaboration? What do you plan to do? And do you have any collaboration with the other NGOs? Thank you so much. We don't have any collaboration with the other NGOs. What we did 2 years ago to the Istanbul, we tried to simply give it to the Istanbul representative, but we did not get any feedback, or we did not have any other response. We heard it from Dr. Kadıoğlu. If you see the community side or party as a victim rather than the party, then you have a process where you're looking for remedy and you don't know where to start. That's so simple. So he says there are many things which are discussed. Yeah, that's what we did today as well. But the beginning part, see, the common denominator there is lacking. He said community resilience, we have not shown so much effort. It was self-evolving. People, he said that, people did not call one another, but he sent SMS. They sent SMS to one another. So that community resilience achieved by the Japanese society and the society level Turkish people failed to achieve. How are we going to bridge the gap? That's what we have to discuss. Of course, we have so many international contacts, particularly. So this is what we would like to tell. In the aftermath of the earthquake, the sanitation need or the waste of sewage, where to transfer guide those. That's going to be one of the gridlocks. And then studies indicate that they are as harmful as the earthquake itself, cholera, so on and so forth, so many communicable diseases. So, raising awareness, as I indicated in my presentation. We have to raise awareness. NGOs have to be institutionalized, not a spreading factor, but a unifying factor. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, tomorrow we have a special session on earthquake. Please do ask your questions over there. And I have a kind request from you. On Change.org, I started a petition. A mobilization movement has to be started. I was able to get 140,000 signatures. The earthquake mobilization, but you do not name it, the campaign. Change.org, please. Go there and put your signature. Join it. Join the movement. You see the details. Let's not terrify the moderator more. Well, thank you so much. Well, I think we don't have any other questions. Distinguished panelists, thank you so much. And I would like to thank you, distinguished audience. Thank you.